Moses was exactly the right leader to lead the people out of Egypt. And Joshua was exactly the right leader to lead the people into the Promised Land. And we're going to go back into that story of the Exodus again today, but this time we're going to go a little bit further back into Numbers chapter 13, which tells the story of Joshua and Caleb. And the story of Joshua and Caleb is, it's taking place right as the Israelites are on the cusp of entering into the Promised Land. And this is a story that many of you know, especially if you grew up in this church. You learned all about it in Sunday school, but it's a story that many of you may not know. So I'm just going to give you a brief little recap, a brief little synopsis of some of the major events that have been leading up to this point. In Numbers chapter 13, when the Israelites are just on the verge of entering into the Promised Land, it was about 2 years prior to this that the Exodus story had really begun in full force. 2 years prior to this was when God encountered Moses at the burning bush, and he told Moses, "It is your job to lead my people out of Egypt." And so, if you've ever seen the Charlton Heston movie, then Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, "Let my people go." And at first, Pharaoh not so politely declines, but then a bunch of plagues happen, and after 10 of those plagues, Pharaoh changes his mind. He says, okay, fine. Take your people and get out of here. And so the Hebrews are set to go free. And they set out into the desert, making their way to the Promised Land. But then some time goes by, and Pharaoh thinks to himself, you know what? My labor costs were a whole lot lower whenever I had slaves doing all of my work for me. So I'm going to go get my Hebrews back. And so Pharaoh gets his army together, and they go through the wilderness to catch up with the Hebrews, and they catch up with them right there on the edge of the Red Sea, and it looks like things are about to go really bad. But then Moses takes his staff, and he dips it into the Red Sea, and the waters part, and Israel walks through on dry land. And Pharaoh and his armies do not walk through on dry land. And so the Israelites, they spend a little bit more time wandering through the wilderness, and they finally get to Mount Sinai, where, among other things, Mount Sinai is where Moses brings the 10 Commandments down from the mountain. God has given the people the 10 Commandments, and Moses brings them down. And then Israel spends some more time wandering through the wilderness. This has been a really long journey. I'm sure you can imagine how many times the kids must have asked, "Are we there yet?" No, we're not there yet. And it's a long journey. By this time, they're starting to run out of food. And God sends manna from heaven. And then the people start to get tired of the manna, and so God sends quail for the people to eat. This is a long journey. It's a hard journey. But don't you see how God has been providing for them every step of the way? And so finally they get right up to the border of the Promised Land, the land that God has been leading them to this entire time, the land of their ancestors, the land that they have longed for generation after generation. And they get right up to the border. And so they do the natural thing. They send some spies into the land to kind of scope things out, to get the lay of the land. Now, the reason that they are sending the spies, it's not so that they can decide whether or not to enter the land. That decision has long been made. That's the plan. They are going in. But they still have to do things like they've got to make maps so that they'll know where to go. They've got to make battle plans. They've got to divide up the land between the people of Israel. So that's why they are sending the spies. And Joshua and Caleb are 2 of those 12 spies. And what those spies find when they get to the Promised Land is truly remarkable. Because what they find is the Promised Land itself was truly remarkable. On the one hand, it is everything that you would expect a land called the Promised Land to be like, right? It's got water sources that are plentiful. The land itself is fertile, great for cattle, great for farming, great for doing the things that they need the land to do. This is just great property that they are going to. In fact, the spies say that it is indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. And while they are there, they find these bunches of grapes that are so big that 2 people have to carry them. The land itself is truly remarkable. But there is something else remarkable that they find when they get there, and it's not remarkable in a good way. Because the other thing that they find when they get to the Promised Land is that this is a land filled with giants. People who are just much bigger and stronger than they are. In fact, the scriptures tell us that these are the people from whom Goliath would later descend. And not only did they have giants, these people who are much larger and stronger than they are, the cities within this land had these enormous fortified walls. They were fortified cities. These walls were so big and so thick, and the Israelites, they didn't have the kind of technology that it would have required to make it through those fortified cities. And so, on the one hand, this is a remarkable land. And this is a great land that God has promised us. But on the other hand, man, the deck is kind of stacked against us. And among the 10 spies, there were 2 stark reactions to this. On the one hand, you have the 10, not Joshua and Caleb, but the 10 other spies who they take a look at this situation and they think, guys, I don't think we can do this. Those people in there, they've got giants. We don't have any giants. They say to the people, those people in there, they've got fortified cities. They've got these huge walls. We don't have catapults. We don't have the kind of artillery that it would take to get through those walls. We cannot do this. We need to just stay right here. We are safe right here. We know we're safe right here. We need to stay right here because promised land or not, if we set foot in that land, we are going to die. And then Joshua and Caleb have a completely different response. Joshua and Caleb say to the people, they say, guys, we can do this, right? We can do this. God has promised us this land. We can do this. Yes, I know that they've got giants. I know that they've got walls. But don't you remember what happened at the Red Sea when Moses put his staff into the water and the waters parted and we crossed over in dry land? They might have giants, but they don't have anybody that can do that. We can do this. God is on our side. This is what God is calling us to. But unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of the people sided with the 10 who said, we cannot do this. We cannot do this. They did not trust God. They said to God, nope, we're staying right here. We are safe right here. We are going to stay right here. And so God says to the people, essentially, if that's what you want to do, fine. If you want to stay put, I will allow you to stay put. But 40 years from now, your children will enter this promised land, and you won't, because you were afraid. Except for Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb can enter with your children because they have courage. Because they have courage. And that's exactly what happened. A generation of Israelites lived out the rest of their life in the wilderness because they were too afraid to enter God's promised land. And I mean, they weren't just living in the they lived out the rest of their days on the doorstep of the promised land. They could almost see into it. But they were too afraid. And the thing is that what was true for Israel back then is just as true for us today. That fear will always keep us stuck in the wilderness, while just a little bit of courage might lead you into something so much better. Now, this virtue of courage, I think, is really important. In fact, the Bible apparently thinks it's really important too. There are some scholars who estimate that the Bible contains the instructions to not fear about 365 times in the scripture, which is, the Bible tells us to not fear almost more than it tells us anything else. Do not be afraid. So clearly this virtue of courage is pretty important. And so what I want us to do today is I want us to think a little bit about what it means to have courage. Because if it was important for Israel, if it's important to God, it's important for us too. So what is courage? How do we define it? Well, let's start by thinking about it like this. If I were to ask you, and by the way, this is not a rhetorical question, you feel free to answer it. If I were to ask you, what is the opposite of courage, what would you say? Right, fear. So the opposite of courage we think of as fear. And in many ways, that's exactly right. However, we also have to think about the fact that courage and fear, while we think of them as opposites, they are not mutually exclusive. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. In fact, I think that a lot of you will find that some of your most courageous moments in your life come in that same hour of your deepest fear. And so fear is almost a prerequisite to have courage, right? So these two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, like if you look at the story of Joshua and Caleb, I'm willing to bet that Joshua and Caleb, when they were in the promised land, when they saw those giants, when they saw those fortified cities, are you going to tell me that they didn't feel even an ounce of fear? I think that they probably did, right? They knew that the deck was stacked against them, just like the other 10 spies knew that the deck was stacked against them. I think they saw that. I don't think they were being unrealistic about the situation. But the difference between Joshua and Caleb and the other 10 spies is that Joshua and Caleb refused to let their fear keep them stuck. Right? They refused to let their fear keep them stuck, because courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is when you choose to do what is right in spite of your fear. No matter how much fear you might be feeling, courage is when you choose to do what you're supposed to do anyway. That's what courage is. And so the difference between fear and courage is really this, that fear is something that you feel. Fear is a feeling. Fear is something that you feel. Courage, on the other hand, courage is something that you do. Courage is an action. And courage is when you are able to act in the right way, in the way that, according to where you know you're supposed to be acting, when you act in that direction, regardless of how much fear you might be feeling in the moment. So that's the difference between courage and fear. One is a feeling and one is an action. But here's the tricky thing about feelings. Oftentimes, feelings can exert an inordinate amount of control over the way we act. If you've ever known someone who struggles with depression or anxiety, they can tell you how true that is. Even though feelings and actions are two different things, feelings can exert an inordinate amount of control over the ways that we act. And acting against our feelings is not as easy for some people as it is for others on the one hand, but all of us in our lives, we come into these times and into these situations where we know what the right thing is, but our feelings are keeping us from acting in the way that we know that we ought to act. And so this is the tension between fear and courage, and this is what we have to overcome. And so what I want us to think about today is how do we overcome that feeling of fear so that it won't keep us stuck where we are, so that we can act in the ways that God has called us to act, so that we can move in a courageous direction. For some of you in here, whatever fear you struggle with may be job related. Some of you may be struggling with a fear related to your marriage. Maybe you're worried about the direction that your marriage is headed in. Some of you may have fears about the way your children are growing up. We all have different fears that we struggle with. And so this is a message for all of us today. But there's one kind of category that I think serves as a microcosm for the way this relationship between fear and courage works. And that category is procrastination. Have any of you ever known or been a procrastinator? I'm not asking you to tell me which. Have any of you ever known or been a procrastinator, right? We've all procrastinated at something in our lives at some point, and we've all known procrastinators. So here's the thing about procrastination. If you've ever been a procrastinator or if you've ever known a procrastinator, one of the things that they will tell you is that procrastinating, it's really not about being lazy, right? Typically, it's not about being lazy. I suppose sometimes it is, but typically the struggle of a procrastinator is not a struggle with laziness. Typically, procrastination is about fear, right? We're afraid of, if we're given an assignment and we're afraid we're not going to be able to do the assignment right, we procrastinate on it because we are afraid that we are going to fail. In fact, we are so afraid that we are going to fail that we won't even take the first step. And we remain stuck. But what are we guaranteeing by not taking that first step? We are guaranteeing failure. And that is how all fear works. When we give in to fear, we remain, just like the Israelites, stuck exactly where we are. And that is the best case scenario with fear, with giving into it. Because normally when we give into fear, fear will actually set you back a few steps. But the best case scenario is that we remain stuck exactly where we are. And so, how do we get unstuck? How do we get unstuck? Well, this is a complicated topic, and we could spend all day talking about it, but we're not going to spend all day talking about it. However, in the time we have left, there are two things that I want to point out. Two things that I want to point out about the way that we can get unstuck from fear. And the first thing is this. Think about that procrastinator again. The procrastinator stays stuck where they are because they are overwhelmed by the big picture, right? And so the first thing we've got to do is, for just a moment, we've got to stop obsessing over the big picture and just look one step ahead. The first thing that we've got to do to come unstuck from fear is to take one step. That's it. Just take the first step. And I understand that, it's not always as easy as I'm making it sound right now. Taking that first step is not always as easy as it sounds, but it's so necessary. We've got to stop being overwhelmed by the possibility we might fail in the future, that we do nothing in the present. And so we've got to take that first step. If your particular fear has to do with your marriage, and you're worried about the big picture, I might get divorced, take the first step. Pick up the telephone. Make an appointment with that marriage counselor. Step one, don't be so paralyzed by what might happen in the future that you fail to move forward in the present. Take that first step, and then after you've taken that first step, you'll be able to see a little bit further ahead to where step 2 is, right? Because the first step leads you into the second step. It has always been the case that young people struggle with, when they get out of their parents' house and they're kind of out on their own, they struggle with this idea of, what am I supposed to do with my life? And that situation, while that has always been the case, it's kind of the case even more today than it has been in the past. Just the way our society works, there is a little bit more time between leaving home and making a home of your own. And so young people today, they spend a whole lot more time laboring over this question, what am I supposed to do with my life? And here's the thing about laboring over that question so much, is that there are some people who spend so much time obsessing, what am I supposed to do with the big picture of my entire life, that they feel like they can't take a single step in any direction until they've got the big picture figured out. But that's not the way it works. You've got to take one step. And so if you're a young person and you feel paralyzed by, what am I supposed to do with my life? Just stop thinking about that big, imposing question for just a little while. Just set it aside. Set it aside and think about, what can I do right now? What can I do right now? Whether it's I need to go get a job, or whether it's I need to be serving in ministry, or what do I need to be doing right now? And even if you don't have a clear sense of what you need to be doing right now, just do something, right? Just do something. And here's the important part of what I'm saying here. Not only should you just do something, but whatever it is that you are doing in the now, nail it. Knock it out of the park. Whatever it is that you are doing right now, do it with excellence. Even if you're not sure if this is the thing you're supposed to be spending the rest of your life, even if this is not a part of what the big picture of what God has planned for you, whatever you find yourself doing right now, do it with the most excellence that you can muster. Because what you will find is that if you will do now with excellence, the now will lead to the next. Take the first step, and then you'll be able to have a clearer picture of where that second step is. And after you take that second step, you'll have a clearer picture of where that third step is. Stop letting fear and being overwhelmed about the big picture keep you from taking a step now. Once again, I realize that a lot of this stuff, it is easier said than done. And so I said that there were two things that I wanted to focus on. And so the second thing is something that I think can help us to come unstuck enough to even take that first step. And that is this. We've got to have trust. We have to have trust in God, that God has a plan for us and that it is a plan to benefit us and not to harm us, right? That God has a plan. And we also have to trust each other. One of the things that you see about Joshua and Caleb in Numbers 13 is that it was very clear that they trusted God. They were able to remember back on what God had done for them all of this time, leading them up to the doorstep of the promised land. And because of what God had done for them in the past, they fully trusted that God would continue to do that in the future. We've got to trust God. And we're going to come back to this idea of trusting God in a moment, because it is the most important idea. And so I want to save the bigger discussion about this for the end. But don't you think that Joshua and Caleb also trusted each other? I mean, when I read through this story and Caleb so courageously gets up after the 10 spies have given their bad report and he says, no, we can do this. We've just got to trust God. Don't you think that part of why Caleb was able to bravely do that is because he knew Joshua had his back? I mean, we don't know this, but it's easy for me to imagine that if Caleb had been the only one, he might have kept his mouth shut. But he had Joshua, and he knew that Joshua had his back. We've got to be able to trust each other. We are entering a season in the life of our church where some things are going to change. Some things have already been changing. And, I've been able to be on this journey with a lot of you. And so I've seen two pretty stark reactions when it comes to all of the changes that we've been making. And then a lot of folks have had reactions that are sort of in between. So one of the reactions that people have had with all of the changes that are happening is, man, this is just so exciting. Like, I've got nothing but hope about the future of our church, and I'm so excited about these changes. Let's just make more of them. Let's just do this thing, right? And they are nothing but excited about the direction that our church is headed. And then you have another group of folks who, it isn't that they aren't excited about the changes and they aren't excited about the new things that God is doing in our congregation, but it's just that there is a little bit of fear and a little bit of hesitation mixed in with that excitement, right? And that should be expected, because for most people, change is not easy. Change is hard. And so if you are in that category where you've got some fear mixed in about the direction of our church, or you've got some hesitation mixed in about the direction of our church, I want to ask something of you. I want to ask you to trust us, to trust each other. You are our church. We love you. And we promise to you right here and right now that we will not leave you behind. We will continue to be your church. You will continue to be ministered to by this church. You will continue to know that you are loved and valued at Lazy Brook Baptist Church. Trust us. Let's trust each other. Now, if you fit within that category of the other folks who I've talked about, you're just so excited and nothing but excitement about the changes that are coming down the road. I hope you were listening, because I just made a promise on your behalf. Now, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have asked for your permission first, but I figured this is one of those situations where it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, right? So I have just made a promise on your behalf, and I would like for you not to make a liar out of me, please. That would be fantastic. Let's remember this promise that we've just made. That for some people, change is hard. For most people, change is hard. And we've got to love them, and we've got to bring them on, right? We've got to bring them on board. We need to let them know that this church is still their church too, right? Oftentimes, when we let the big picture keep us from moving forward, it's because we're afraid of failure. Part of this whole trust thing is that when you have a strong network of trust, you understand that even if you do fail, it's probably not the end of the world, right? And so when you have a strong network of trust in your life, when you trust the people around you, when you trust God, genuinely trust God, it frees you up so that you can kind of look at failure and say, you know what, if I fail, I want to succeed. I'm going to try my best to succeed. I'm going to try my best not to fail. But if I do, it's not the end of the world. In fact, failure can sometimes even be a good thing. Failure can, whenever we do fail, if we look at it as a learning opportunity, we can look at that failure and we can dissect it and we can understand why we failed, and we're in a better position not to repeat that failure because we learned something from the first failure. When we have that strong network of trust, all of a sudden, failure is not so bad because we know that even if we fail, somebody's got our back. If you're afraid about something going on at work, you're afraid about a job situation, it's a whole lot harder for you to approach your workspace with courage if you don't trust your boss and if you don't trust your coworkers. And I want you to hear me. I'm not saying that you should just go around blindly, granting people trust in your life that haven't earned it, or granting people trust who have betrayed your trust. But what I am saying is this: that if you want to move forward in your life in any area, you need to work on establishing a network of trust with people. If you don't have that network of trust, that's something you've got to get to work on. Gathering people around you that you can trust, so that you've got that safety net, so that you can feel okay about the possibility of failure, so that you don't have to be afraid to move forward. But regardless of where you are in that situation, and regardless of where you are in the spectrum that I was talking about within our church, about the new things that are coming, whether you fall on the side of total excitement or excitement mixed with a little fear and hesitation, there is one thing I know for sure: that this time during the life of our church is a time where we all need to come together, not only in our trust for one another, but this is also a time where we need to be leaning into our trust in God. Because trust in God is where the rubber always meets the road when we're trying to overcome fear in our life. Trust in God is where the rubber always meets the road with this whole issue of having courage in the midst of our fear. St. Thomas Aquinas said that every fear that we have at some point relates back to our ultimate fear of death. Every fear that we have at some point relates back to our ultimate fear of death. And morbid as that may be, I think he is onto something there. But here's the thing about being a people whose faith and trust is in Christ Jesus. Death has already been overcome on your behalf. Earlier I said that we've got to get to a place where I said something effective: even if we fail, it's probably not going to kill us. But even if it does, as a person whose faith and trust is in Jesus, even that is not the end for you, right? And we as Christians who believe in the resurrection of the dead, who know that not even death can defeat us, we ought to be the most courageous people on this planet. If we know that not even death can defeat us, then there is no other failure, there is no other obstacle that can defeat us either, because the biggest one has already been defeated for us. There is no reason for us to be stuck in our fear. If we will take things one step at a time, and if we will lean into our trust in Jesus. Because one of the things that our faith teaches us, just like Angie's mom told her, you were not made to be a chicken. You were made to be an eagle. So be an eagle. Be an eagle. As we approach our invitation time, I want to invite you to pray for each other. If there is somebody in this room that you feel led to pray with, to pray for, I want to give you an opportunity to use this time, this altar call time, to establish a relationship of trust with someone else in this room by praying with them. Right? And I want to ask you to pray for something specific. Remember, Tom asked us last week if on Zach's first Sunday we would be willing to come forward at the altar time and to let Zach know that in whatever direction God is leading him, we as a church would follow. And I want to ask you to find a prayer partner right here in this room today. And you don't even have to come forward to the altar. You can pray with them right next to each other in the pew if that's what you would like to do. But I want you to find somebody to pray with today, to pray for our church, to pray that God would build in us the kind of trust that is required to move in the direction that He's called us without fear, but in full faith and in full hope and in full trust. And I'm going to invite you to do that as we sing.